Welcome to Diligent Canine, and in this video I'm going to talk about some things that I learned in a recent bite work session with my dog as it pertains to targeting and paying attention to the bite. So I recently listened to the Working Dog Radio podcast episode with Franco Angelini, and they were talking about paying attention to the dog's bite. They talked about lots of other things as well, but that really stuck with me. Obviously, it seems like common sense, but there are a lot of things you can learn if immediately when the dog grips, your eyes go right to the mouth, the bite, and paying attention to what's happening. So yesterday, the weather is not ridiculously hot anymore here in Georgia, at least for the time being. So I went out for a bite session with my dog Dean, and I did some green dog testing and courage test, drive channeling. I posted about both of those exercises before from Controlled Aggression, Jerry Bradshaw's book. And the thing I noticed right off with Dean is that his butt was swinging way out on the bite. So in a typical courage test type of situation, the dog would be seated. I'd be walking towards the dog, give a command, and the dog would charge in and bite. Now, what I noticed was he was biting the inside of my forearm. So with the typical presentation like so, the dog would bite the inside of the forearm. He would bite inside, but he would avoid the bicep and go for the forearm instead. And while he was doing so, his butt would swing way wide to the outside. So when I started noticing that, right away I thought, okay, I'm going to put the dog on a back tie, the back of the table, so I can really get up in his face and really get a close look at what's happening without trying to address the bite, like while the dog's flying through the air, jumping up at me. You know, that is one major benefit of putting them on an elevated platform, whether that's a picnic table, a truck bed, any sort of elevated platform with a back tie, so you can really get a close look at that bite. And I'll come back to this in a minute, but I put him on the back tie on the table and did some agitation, offered a bite, and the grip was good. It was hard, it was deep, it was a little chewy, but he was countering relatively well, and I got really confused. I took the dog off, slipped the sleeve, and did a few more reps where the dog was still hanging way wide on my forearm. Sorry, he was biting the inside of my forearm, and his rear was hanging way wide. And it wasn't until I watched a couple videos that I was shooting during the training session, and this is an important point to think about why it is a good idea to record your training sessions and to watch them. I noticed that I was cueing the dog to go wide. And what I mean by that is, in an approach situation like I was talking about, where you're kind of on a collision course literally towards each other, I don't want to jam up the dog and hurt their back or their hips or something like that. So I'm not necessarily running forward to tackle the dog. I'm a shorter person, so my dog's rear legs almost don't need to come off the ground for him to bite up in my shoulder bicep area. So I don't want to jam them into the ground and really cram them up. So what I found watching the video was that to sort of ease and go with that momentum, when the dog would jump to bite, I was starting to lean my shoulder back. And of course, what has happened over time then is that my dog started to anticipate that the left arm bite right before the strike, that he started to anticipate that my arm would drift back. So the dog anticipating that, again, not anticipating where my bicep is, but where it's going to be when my shoulder falls back, meant that when that didn't happen, he was biting wide onto my forearm. I posted some pictures to Instagram yesterday, and I'm sure I'll include them in the Patreon edition of this video as well, and really break down and look at the progression of what happened. So the first picture has the dog biting on the inside of my forearm, and I had to really think about how am I going to change this presentation. Even when I really chicken winged my arm, he was going wide to the forearm. So I had to think about, what am I going to do? How am I going to present this differently? I don't want to jam the dog up. I don't want to cue him. How am I going to present? So the quick solution I found then was that I gave a very awkward presentation where my forearm is out of the picture, and the easiest thing for the dog to bite is my bicep. So it's the closest target, it's obviously presented, and that's the next picture. Now I was surprised on this where Dean actually bit high enough and hard enough, his targeting was good enough that he actually came up over my arm to come down onto my bicep. I think maybe the first one or two he came up into the tricep, but have a nice nap. But he actually came up over and down onto my bicep pretty quickly. So that's how I sort of isolated just the bicep, and I took the forearm out of the picture. It was no longer available. So that was the next series of pictures. But if you look at that picture still, you can see my hip positioning is still off. So if we're talking about a left side bicep target, in that case, my left hip was still back. So I'm sitting down right now, but from a standing position, I was still sort of twisted like this, but my left hip was back. So there's still a little bit of drop in my body, or my body positioning. So the next picture I posted after that, it looks like a very similar bite position. I still have a very obvious bicep presentation with the forearm taken away or held elevated out of the way, but my hips are coming forward. So there's a little bit of a twist in my body the other direction. So I'm kind of I'm over exaggerating the other direction. So instead of dropping my arm back, I'm really kind of like pushing it forward with my hips. Then obviously, in the last picture that I posted, I'm in a more typical bicep presentation with my hand dropped down and shoulder forward, and the bite is still right in the pocket. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting point for reflection, to highlight a couple issues there. One, sometimes you have to troubleshoot stuff. I've done a lot of foundation bite work with Dean, nothing super advanced, but all these skills that we teach our dogs, they're perishable, which means it doesn't take a whole lot to maintain them, but they do degrade if you don't invest any upkeep in them. And two, the importance of videoing your training sessions so that you can analyze when things are not going well, or when a hiccup or a roadblock, something happens that you don't expect. You can analyze the issue and use your critical thinking skills to try to problem solve. How am I going to train around or through this? And the last thing that I just want to talk about briefly, going back to the table work, it's not a secret that one way to teach countering is to apply pressure, some sort of pressure or duress to the dog, and when they drive in to the bite, that pressure is relieved. So this is using basic behavior principles, but in the specific context of biting. Now, I've used this technique before, but what makes it special in this scenario was the subtlety of it. So holding with my dog on a bite on a table on my left bicep, my hand is pretty close to like his jaw and neckline. So I was able to just hold his head here, able to kind of like squeeze, again, not causing any pain, but just some pressure. I squeezed around his ear, and that was enough. I didn't have to grab his scalp. I didn't have to grab the scruff of his neck. I didn't have to do anything. The stimulus was very subtle as far as what was required to make him growl a little and then drive in, and it was very easy then for me to let go. So that was another example of applying pressure when the dog performs the behavior that you're asking for, pressure is relieved. So I hope you enjoyed this edition of Canine Reflections. Any questions, I'd be happy to talk you through them or discuss training concepts. As always, remember to support military and working dogs by subscribing on patreon.com/diligentcanine.